Okay, well, this week the Twitterverse was ablaze after The Atlantic magazine dropped a hot new profile on progressive activist Sean McElwee. Now, if you're not on Twitter or just generally not extremely online, you've probably never heard of Sean McElwee before, which is probably for the best, but the response to the article revealed an important political fault line on the liberal left, and it's worth going deeper into what that means. Broadly speaking, there are two options for anyone that is hoping to pass any meaningful progressive, let alone socialist policies. One is the coalitional approach with the Democratic Party, and this is the one that Sean McElwee represents. The other is the confrontational approach. This is, broadly speaking, the position of most of the people in the Jacobin orbit, and I conclude myself in that. But as Jared Abbott pointed out in the pages of Jacobin, it's important to take the McElwee position seriously. And Abbott even admits that it is a compelling case for a number of reasons. So what is the coalitional strategy? Basically, it entails playing nice with the vast majority of the Democratic Party leaders, senators, congressmen, etc. The idea is that you primary vulnerable centrists only when you're absolutely sure to win, and once in power, you do your best not to alienate them, but to convince them that progressive policies are in their best political interests. The Atlantic profile describes a meeting between McElwee and Joe Biden's policy team. Quote, in their March meeting, McElwee and a colleague attempted to persuade the Biden team to endorse a kind of quasi-Green New Deal. Their hope, if the presumptive Democratic nominee took a stronger stance on climate change in particular, he could get more young people and progressives excited about his campaign. They urged the campaign to endorse a commitment to reaching net zero emissions by mid-century and to invest in low-income communities that are disproportionately affected by pollution. The Biden team was worried that moving left on climate would be all risk and no reward, but McElwee assured them that it would be both popular and good policy. And here's the important part. They didn't extract much in the way of immediate commitments, but McElwee told me after the meeting that he had a longer-term plan. Fair enough. They were heard, and they didn't get any firm commitments, but at least they were in the room. And McElwee argues that a lot of left-wing ideas simply aren't popular, and you have to be realistic about that. You just got to look at the hard numbers and then run on those policies you support that are actually popular, like, say, childcare benefits, and not something unpopular, like, say, abolishing ICE, which ironically McElwee himself famously pushed incessantly just a couple of years ago. And that's actually true to an extent. But there are two problems with that approach. One is that a poll here and there doesn't really paint an accurate picture of what is popular. To get a better understanding, you have to look at several polls over time. The Atlantic profile points out that according to Sean McElwee's own polling firm, Data for Progress, the polling offers clear lessons, McElwee argues. Instead of a carbon tax, candidates should talk about investing 100% clean energy, an idea that 51% of respondents favored. They would do well to campaign heavily on paid family leave, which received 60% support, and instead of championing Medicare for all, which according to his firm is at 40% support, leftist candidates who need to win over Republicans and moderates should push to expand Medicaid and, quote, motherfuck the pharmaceutical industry. Translation, this is according to the writer of the profile, revoke patent rights on the most expensive drugs and approve government manufacturing of generics, an inspiring political message if there ever was one. So yeah, that's Data for Progress's poll about Medicare for all, but here's another poll that says that a very nice 69% of voters support Medicare for all, and that furthermore, that support has remained, quote, consistently strong over the past 2 years. So who's to know? But let's grant that it's better to run on popular things than unpopular things. That's obvious. No one can disagree with that. But here is where the second, and I would argue more crucial problem with the coalitional approach comes into play. How do you hold elected leaders accountable once they are in office? What McElwee and others who believe in this approach, like Justice Democrats Waleed Shahid, often refer to the left as being, quote, junior partners in a coalition. There's only one problem with this in the context of the United States. The junior partners in a coalition have essentially zero leverage to force the senior partners in the coalition to do anything. This language, the partners in a coalition, comes from parliamentary systems where it actually makes sense. Like in Spain, where I'm from, for example, the center-left party PSOE won the most seats in parliament, but short from an outright majority, which would give them enough to take power. So they needed to cut a deal with the far-left Podemos party in order to join forces and get a majority of the seats in parliament and then take power. In exchange for their support, Podemos, the junior partners in the coalition, extracted some concessions. Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, managed to become the deputy prime minister as well as a ministerial post. And they are able to keep the more conservative PSOE party somewhat honest, because if they feel that PSOE, reminder, the senior partners in the coalition, get too conservative, they can withdraw their support and force new elections. And they've used this leverage to pass some decent reforms, like an increased minimum vital income, and are working on a tax on millionaires to fund the COVID recovery. But that leverage, the pulling out of the coalition and forcing new elections, doesn't exist in the United States. Once someone wins an election, they've got 4 years to do whatever the hell they want. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren will support Biden, but are unlikely to be rewarded for their efforts with a cabinet post, simply because Biden has no reason to give one to either of them. The left has no meaningful way to threaten Biden while he is in power. So the junior partner in the coalition will get a little lip service during the election and then be thoroughly ignored afterward. So what, you ask, is the alternative? Well, the alternative is the confrontational approach. Basically, this position argues that the Democratic Party has bled working class support, that its leadership and, for lack of a better term, brand, have become toxic outside of urban coastal enclaves, giving it a structural disadvantage in national politics. And as Jared Abbott points out in his piece, the numbers are staggering. In 1982, nearly half of all working class voters identified as Democrats, but by 2018, that figure had fallen to less than a third, even as the Republican Party saw no uptick. But the left can't get in bed with the Republicans, so what is there to do? Well, basically, you keep trying the Bernie Sanders strategy of running as a sort of independent that is not wedded or tied to the Democratic Party. In electoral terms, this is Abbott speaking, in electoral terms, it entails building a primarily working class support base focused on non-voters and independents with weak partisan attachments to the Democratic Party, as well as working class Democratic partisans who feel sufficiently disillusioned with the party leadership to take a chance on insurgent primary candidates. The confrontation strategy could also be carried out at any level of government, depending on what resources are available. This approach by no means rules out the possibility of making strategic alliances with existing blocs in the Democratic Party coalition, like, for example, the decision of Bernie Sanders to caucus with congressional Democrats despite his strong public denunciations of the Democratic Party over several decades, is a good example. In general, however, the confrontational strategy privileges electoral threat over persuasion and mutual accommodation. And that, very importantly, requires building institutions independent of the Democratic Party, no easy task, but an infrastructure that can help with things like fundraising, policy work, and much like Data for Progress, polling. These institutions would run candidates on the Democratic Party line, but refuse to accept things like funding from the DCCC and such. And these candidates would run on things that are broadly popular with working class voters, like Medicare for all, taxes on the rich, collective bargaining rights, and so on, and then remain accountable to the independent institution for things like funding and logistical support. Should they prove unwilling to support the agenda they ran on, the institution would pull their support, and without support from the Democratic Party machinery, they would likely lose their seat. So it's a way to keep them accountable. And there's one major problem with this approach. Admittedly, it hasn't really worked in recent years. Bernie did worse with rural white working class voters in 2020 than he did in 2016, and left-wing candidates have mostly done well in blue districts, and they have yet to have any meaningful success in red districts, which is key to the strategy. It has, however, worked in the past. As Jared Abbott points out, the most successful examples of the confrontation strategy have come at the state level, most notably in North Dakota and Minnesota in the 1910s and 1920s. In North Dakota, the Nonpartisan League, NPL, successfully took over the Republican Party between 1916 and 1918 by creating an electoral organization distinct from the party. The organization used the primary system to wage an open electoral war against the Republican establishment in the state. And by 1918, as Richard Vallely describes, the NPL had seized control of the North Dakota government to an extent simply unknown in American state politics before or since then. Based on this extraordinary electoral success, the NPL in 1919 was able to push through wide-ranging reforms in education, healthcare, and other public services, even in the face of extreme oppositions from elites in the state. Abbott continues. In Minnesota, the NPL created an electoral organization to compete in the Republican primaries. It was so successful that it prompted Republicans to ban NPL candidates from running independent campaigns in the general election after first losing in the Republican primaries. Since Minnesota was effectively a one-party Republican state at the time, and since the NPL was already a powerful electoral force, in 1922 it chose to abandon its Republican primary strategy and instead create the Independent Farmer Labor Party. During its heyday in the 1920s and 1930s, the Minnesota FLP was able to elect 3 governors, 4 U.S. senators, and 8 U.S. House of Representatives, in addition to securing majorities in the Minnesota state legislature. And in recent years, this strategy has worked, just not on the left, but on the right. In many ways, the extraordinary success of the Tea Party was an example of how the confrontational approach to politics can pull squishy centrist members to your flank. The Tea Party targeted most of its ire on the Republican establishment running in opposition to what they called rhinos in the primary, famously knocking out Eric Cantor, who at the time was the second most powerful member of Congress. Once in power, the Tea Partiers stayed true to their extreme agenda, refusing to go along with the grand Obama-Boehner bargain for not going far enough in cutting Social Security. Republicans began to worry more about primary challenges from the right than the general election. So the Tea Party has undoubtedly succeeding in pulling the Republican Party dramatically to the right. Of course, they had the advantage of billionaire financing from figures like the Koch brothers, and the left would encounter more challenges than they did as a result, but it's still an example of how the dynamic can work. So those are the 2 choices for the left: coalition or confrontation. Coalition is less risky, but with little chance of achieving any meaningful reforms. The confrontational approach is scary, but is the one with the potential to make the Democratic Party one of the working class, and therefore one that can deliver the type of reform that benefits the many, instead of the party of Halliburton Democrats, as Matt Karp says, and thus one that will never do anything other than diversify the board of Goldman Sachs and pass tax credits and Pell Grants to entrepreneurs who operate a business for 4 years in an underserved community. And back to McElwee. The kicker of that Atlantic article, which is supposed to be a massive own to the left. The writer says, late one evening in mid-July, I got a text from McElwee. Had I seen the Bloomberg scoop? Biden was about to announce a package of climate proposals advocated by some of the most progressive climate groups. The next day, I watched as Biden, standing on a flag-decorated stage in Wilmington, Delaware, peeled back his face mask and unveiled a new plan that would invest $2 trillion over 4 years to achieve 100% clean energy by 2035. The proposal would also guarantee that 40% of all clean energy funding goes to marginalized communities. McElwee had gotten what he wanted. Oh, great. McElwee had gotten what he wanted. I guess Joe Biden has promised to put some decent climate policy on his campaign website. But once he is in office, what will he do in the face of resistance? Will Biden hold the line and work to pass this quasi-Green New Deal? Or will he fold immediately? What can Sean McElwee do to force him to hold the line? The answer is nothing.
That was, you're just so spot on. And I love the historical references you pointed to, especially when how the more confrontational route helps. It's certainly helped Republicans in the past. I think it could help the left moving forward. And one thing that's become clear to me at a time when things seem so uncertain, unstable, and up in the air is that the Democratic Party, corporate Democrats specifically, people like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and so-called moderate Democrats, we're not the same. We're not even close. Like, it's 2 different ideologies, and you need to know your enemies, right? Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are not our friends. They're not interested in working with us. The only time there might be a little bit of agreement policy-wise is when we're discussing social issues. That's what the Democratic Party has really latched onto for decades now in order to differentiate themselves from the Republican Party. But make no mistake, when it comes to the bread and butter issues, the issues that matter in regard to our material conditions, Democrats and Republicans have been in cahoots. They've been in cahoots for a while. They will continue to work together on these issues. One of the stories that broke just this week and got very little attention, we did cover it on TYT though, was how Senate Democrats have completely backed away from reversing the Trump era tax cuts for the wealthy. Because of course they have. They're wealthy themselves. They couldn't be more different, in terms of their own wealth and their own lifestyles from working Americans and leftists. And so I agree with you. I mean, you mentioned how the confrontational approach is a little more risky than the coalition approach. I mean, what's scarier than what we're experiencing right now?
That's true. That's a
right?
good point.
So, I mean, yeah. So I feel like the riskiest thing we can possibly do is constantly put all of our eggs in this corporate Democrat basket, which, they're going to drop that basket. They're going to crush it. They don't care. They don't care. Their material conditions don't change.
Yeah.
Ours will either stay the same or continue to deteriorate. So I love that commentary. I think you're spot on. And, I actually hadn't heard of that activist at all until now. And I think he's some sort of weird corporate Democrat plant.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting. I'm going through Rick Perlstein's latest book, Reaganland. And, a lot of the analogy that we have for the confrontational approach, I mean, there's these examples on the right. One of them is the sort of Barry Goldwater revolution in the Republican Party, of which the culmination was the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. In 1976, when Gerald Ford, who Reagan and the Barry Goldwater wing of the Republican Party basically saw as their enemy, like a liberal, similarly analogous to what you're just talking about, like the Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, just so far different, so different from us that it's impossible to. Reagan refused to campaign for Gerald Ford in 1976. Like, I can only imagine, like, the reaction today if, like, he was the governor of California and like, his star was rising big time. I mean, he had, passionate supporters. And he campaigned for Gerald Ford, maybe Ford would have won against Jimmy Carter. Instead, Reagan refused. He was like not playing ball with a person who he saw as like a dangerous liberal, and then ended up winning the presidency in 1980 and transforming American society as a result.
Yeah, for the worse.
Obviously, for the worst. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, one other thing you mentioned was Bernie's appeal to white working class voters in 2016 versus 2020, when that number had actually dropped considerably. You had a great interview with Matt Karp on the day that I wasn't here. Everyone who missed that interview, please check it out. It was so good, and it's going to go more in depth than what we have time for right now. But, I am curious. Bernie faced a lot of pressure in 2020 to pivot more toward the identity politics stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He's still, of course, focused on the issues that matter to a broader range of people. But I do think that unfortunately hurt him with some of these white working class voters, because it's more of the failed liberal, BS that was intentionally meant to deflect from issues that actually impact people financially, economically. You get the picture. So I think that there's even with the best left politicians, they sometimes cave into pressure from dishonest actors to pivot in a direction that's actually incredibly harmful for them. And so you need someone who's, and not just someone, you need a left that's fearless and unafraid of the backlash they're going to get from the corporate Democrats. That backlash is going to come. You should expect it, but you have to remain defiant, as Ronald Reagan did.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I remember in the wake of Bernie 2016, there was the activist class, who had supported Bernie were saying things like, if Bernie, hires Jeff Weaver to be his campaign manager ever again, it'll show that he never learned his lesson or whatever. And, actually, I think Bernie has probably better political instincts than all of you put together. But a similar thing happened to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, especially on Brexit, which was became a culture war social issue that we would see here today. And he kind of caved to the pressure from his kind of more urbane base to flip-flop on Brexit and run against it. Everyone kind of knew that Corbyn in his heart does not like the European Union. Like that's just, he's always been like that. And he kind of went against it and half-heartedly kind of went along with this, and it was a disaster for him.
It was, yeah.
They bled working class support in the north. Their base is like basically all in the south of England, around London. And it was a disaster, like you said. Like, so you're right that like it does require a little bit of mettle and an ability to sort of hold the line and keep the message ruthlessly focused on the class war, on the bread and butter economic issues. Doesn't mean you have to compromise on any policy or anything like that. Like it's not like Bernie's going to support, I don't know, like the anti-trans bathroom bill just to win elections or something. It's just like you can just ignore a lot of the hot button culture war issues and focus on the bread and butter issues that people actually care about.
It's all about framing, right? It's not to say that Bernie isn't in favor of issues regarding equality and police violence and all that, but it's about framing your campaign in a way that's going to appeal to a larger group of people. And right now, regardless of what your political ideology is, you're experiencing the negative effects of capitalism in your day-to-day lives. Inequality, unaffordable housing, the healthcare issue. I mean, if you're a Republican, you're feeling it. There's no question about that. And so I think that's part of the reason why so many Trump supporters in 2016, after the election, spoke to the press and were like, yeah, I would have voted for Bernie. Bernie would have won. And it's because he spoke to the issues that really matter to them. So, All right. Well, I want to make sure. Oh, Amber's going to join us soon. We're going to have an awesome interview after my segment that I'm really looking forward to. So let's get through my commentary and then get to the interview.